Yes, Mr. Alderking, welcome to the courtroom. You have the floor for your submission.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Honours. In this section of the closing arguments, I'm going to address opportunistic killings and the foreseeable targeted killings charged at paragraphs 22 and 23.1 of the indictment. My main focus today is to address Tolimir's liability for these killings because they were the natural and foreseeable consequences of the joint criminal enterprise to forcibly remove and deport the Muslim population from Srebrenica and Žepa. In other words, as so-called JCE3 crimes. However, Tolimir is also charged with all forms of Article 7.1 responsibility for these crimes under counts 1, 3, 4, 5 and 6 of the indictment, as explained in detail in the prosecution's final brief, and as I'll reiterate today, the evidence of Tolimir's and his security and intelligence subordinates' involvement in the capture, detention and disappearance of the Žepa leaders and of Avdo Palic in particular is compelling, and he should be found guilty for those killings. He should be found guilty not just because the killings were the foreseeable consequences of the forcible removal JCE, but because Tolimir authorized and approved the commission of those crimes, as well as failed to protect those men who he and his subordinates had taken into custody. Looking first at the Srebrenica-related opportunistic killings, there's no need for me to repeat all of the evidence establishing that the killings took place. That's set out in the prosecution's final brief. However, I will make a few remarks on some of those incidents. First, indictment paragraph 22.1a concerns the killing of 9 Bosnian Muslim men who were found by Dutch-Bat soldiers in a field some distance behind the White House in Potocari. This is discussed at paragraph 381 of the prosecution brief. The Dutch eyewitnesses identified those victims who were found lined up by a stream with gunshot wounds in their backs as Bosnian Muslims. In 2006 and 2007, human remains were exhumed from the meadow where the bodies were seen, and these remains have been identified as Bosnian Muslim men reported missing, mostly either from Potocari or from nearby. This evidence can be found in Exhibit P167 at pages 348 to 351 in e-court. Also, the victims can be cross-referenced to the list of persons reported missing and dead after the takeover of the Srebrenica enclave, and that's Exhibit P1777. Second, indictment subparagraph 22.2 charges opportunistic killings in and around Bratunac, when captured Srebrenica Muslims were taken there for temporary detention prior to the move up to the Zvornik area. The evidence of these killings is described at paragraphs 383 to 396 of the prosecution brief. Notably, there is support from at least one Bosnian Serb witness, PW64, as well as Muslim survivors, about killings in Bratunac. Those killings were taking place, of course, during the period when Tolimir's deputy, or chief of security of the main staff, Colonel Beara, was in Bratunac, busily making arrangements for those Muslim men to be transported north to the sites of mass execution. For the other opportunistic killing incidents charged, the relevant evidence is set out in the same part of the prosecution's final brief. Other than the killings at Pitkovsky School, which are described at paragraphs 650, 651, and 656 of the brief. The opportunistic killings all took place in the days following the VRS's takeover of the Srebrenica enclave. The reason why they are charged as JCE foreseeable crimes, unlike the thousands of other killings of Bosnian Muslim males that took place after the attack on Srebrenica, is that they were not highly organized in the same way as the massive and complex operation which was supervised in particular by Beara and other of Tolimir's security and intelligence officer subordinates. Rather, they are killings like the one that happened in the center of Srebrenica town, where your honours may remember on the trial video seeing a man's body in a pool of blood, corresponding to Dražen Ademovic's testimony that he saw one of his 10th sabotage detachment colleagues slit a man's throat near the central mosque. We can see this now on screen. That's from exhibit P2799 at eCourt page 43. If the opportunistic killings weren't organised and managed in the same careful way as the other massive scale killings in the murder operation, you may ask how Tolimir can be found liable for them. Indeed, this kind of question is raised in Tolimir's own final trial brief, where he dismisses JCE 3 as just convict everybody. Of course, JCE as a form of responsibility does not equate to just convict everybody. But it is worth reminding your honours what it does take to convict a JCE member of crimes which go beyond the common shared goals. Simply put, what is required to find a JCE member guilty of a crime beyond the scope of the JCE is to find that the member chose to take part in serious criminal activity, knowing that fellow members might commit additional crimes in the execution of the shared criminal enterprise. If Tolimir willingly took that risk, as he surely did, as evidenced most simply by the fact of his continued participation in the forcible removal JCE, then he should be convicted of such additional crimes as occurred. JCE 3 crimes must be the natural and foreseeable consequences of carrying out the JCE. The appeals chamber has ruled that foreseeable here means that, I quote, the possibility a crime could be committed is sufficiently substantial as to be foreseeable to an accused. End of quote. That's from a 25th of June 2009 decision in the Karadzic case. So the threshold is whether an accused could foresee that additional crimes not were probable, but at least were possible. Applying this analysis to the charged opportunistic killings, what the evidence in this case shows is that Tolimir, and indeed anyone else who would have been in such a high-level, highly informed position within the VRS, and with an interest in the consequences of operations such as the attack and ethnic cleansing of Srebrenica, could foresee the possibility of fatal violence occurring. As heard throughout the trial, retaliatory violence between the warring parties had occurred in and around Srebrenica since 1992. Furthermore, violence towards the Srebrenica Muslims was clearly foreseeable as part of the policy to ethnically cleanse areas claimed as Bosnian Serb land, including the Drina River Valley. And generally, it was foreseeable in light of the brutal history of the war. There can be no suggestion that Tolimir lacked knowledge of the historical build-up hatred, and policy of ethnic cleansing that existed prior to July 1995. More specifically, the evidence demonstrates that Tolimir knew that murderous violence went hand in hand with ethnic cleansing operations. I'm now going to turn from the Srebrenica opportunistic killings to the foreseeable, targeted killings of 3 of Žepa's religious, political, and military leaders, Mehmed Hajrić, Amir Imamović, and Avdo Palić. These men were taken into VRS custody while Tolimir oversaw the final stages of the removal of Žepa's civilian population in July of 1995. To emphasize how closely Tolimir was engaged with the fate of these men in the course of the forcible removal operation, UNPROFOR officer Tom Dibb saw Tolimir having Mehmed Hajrić seized as the last buses were leaving from Bokšenica on the 27th of July. Meanwhile, Avdo Palić had accompanied Tolimir as he led convoys of Muslims away from their homes to the confrontation line at Kladan.
Mr. Elder King, like your predecessors, you should slow down a bit. It's very difficult for the court reporter and the interpreters. Please carry on.
Palić was seen with Tolimir in the centre of Žepa on the 25th of July, 1995. We can see another image taken from the stills book, exhibit P2799 at E-Court page 163, showing Tolimir shaking hands with Palić in Žepa town on that day. And in fact, that is the last known image that we have of Palić, still alive, shaking hands with a man who clearly had power over his life or death. In terms of responsibility for Palić's fate in particular, it would not be much of an exaggeration to say that Tolimir practically chained Palić up himself. Shortly after Palić was taken into custody, Tolimir was sending out intelligence reports based on information he had obtained from Palić. Thereafter, Palić, whom the VRS considered to be a war criminal based on his involvement at the beginning of the war in an attack on a JNA convoy going up to Zlova mountain, Palić never had the hope of fair, humane, or legal treatment, or any hope to see his wife and daughters again. Avdo Palić's last moments together with his family were movingly recounted to the trial chamber when Esma Palić herself came to testify. Avdo Palić was subsequently imprisoned at Rogotica Brigade security officer Zoran Čarkić's apartment. Čarkić then consulted with Bejara in mid-August, and Palić was moved at night to the secret Vanako Mlin military prison in Bielina, before being moved again at night in secret in early September 1995 by main staff intelligence officer Dragomir Pečanac to a destination unknown. You'll recall Pečanac's account of taking Palić to hand him over in a car park in Hampiezak in the middle of the night to an Air Force general, Jovo Marić, who, to fit well with Pečanac's story, died shortly after the war. But only after the East Bosnia Corps guards at that secret prison called the VRS main staff duty officer and received confirmation that Pachanac was acting on behalf of the main staff sector for intelligence and security, would they hand Palic over to Pachanac? Throughout those weeks of detention by the VRS Security Administration, Palic was not even referred to by name, but by the code name Atlantida, which we first saw in the 30th of July 1995 document sent by Charkic on Tolimir's authorization. That detailed how Atlantida was being kept safe and at a location away from the other Shepa Muslim detainees. That's exhibit P1434. All of this evidence underscores the bare minimum conclusion that Tolimir could foresee the possibility that Palic might be killed. Tolimir knew of Palic's incarceration at the hands of men under his command and authority who only days before had been running the greatest murder operation in Europe since the Second World War. Given that Tolimir commanded and supervised those men who captured, detained, and then made Palic disappear, it seems almost trite to say it, but there can be no doubt that Tolimir foresaw that Palic might not, or would not stay alive. Given the evidence, however, the trial chamber should not only convict Tolimir for the Shepa leader's killings based on his JCE3 liability, but also based on his acts and omissions recounted here and in the prosecution final brief under the other charged forms of Article 7.1 liability. Those other forms of liability aside, to further emphasize the degree to which Tolimir could foresee the possible harm that might befall not only Palic, but also Hajric and Imamovic, I would ask you to remember the words of General Mladic when he is seen on the trial video boarding bus after bus, carrying the Muslim population out of Shepa. Mladic is being filmed, and his words are clearly more for the camera than for the poor Muslims being driven from their homes. But as we can see on screen now, exhibit P2798, it's a still shot from the trial video. You may remember that to one group, Mladic says, "No more forgiveness. Now I am giving you your life as a gift." The VRS main staff leadership, particularly General Mladic, of course, and also General Tolimir, was in charge of all decisions concerning the fate of the Shepa population, including having the power of life and death over the Muslims who passed through their hands. Tolimir, based on his background dealing with prisoner issues throughout the war, being informed about all key military events, and in the instance of the Shepa operation, being actually involved and in charge on the ground, knew that particular Shepa Muslims, including the leadership, were at serious risk in the event that they were taken into military custody during the forcible removal operation. For Hajric, Imamovic and Palic, they were not spared, not given their lives as a gift, but instead were captured, detained and murdered before being dumped in the remote grave at Ragalovi, where their remains were recovered only after many years. I have referred in passing to the fact that Hajric, Imamovic and Palic were not the only Shepa Muslims taken into custody by the VRS. under Tolimir's and his subordinates' supervision. Over 40 other men, including Hamdia Torlak, another member of the JEPA leadership, were taken into custody and held in Rogatica, at the same location as Haric and Imamovic. All of those men were forced out of JEPA with the rest of the population in July 1995. But they only left VRS custody in a post-Dayton prisoner handover in January 1996. During the period while Haric, Imamovic and Palic were in custody and then disappeared, not only were other victims of the JEPA forcible removal operation being held in Rogatica, but the VRS was making great efforts to bring back the JEPA Muslims who had fled across the Drina River to Serbia. In addition, there was ongoing work to destroy public buildings and private homes in JEPA to deny the Muslims any possibility of return there. And this is all also detailed in the prosecution's final brief. What this shows is that the VRS's efforts to conclude the ethnic cleansing of JEPA continued after the last buses left JEPA town at the end of July 1995, and those efforts were ongoing at the time when the three leaders were detained and when they later disappeared. Accordingly, their murders undoubtedly occurred as the forcible removal JCE members sought to complete their work in cleansing JEPA of its Muslim population. Now I'd like to address some points that Tolimir has made concerning the JEPA killings in his final trial brief. At paragraph 478, Tolimir writes, I quote, "The basic questions regarding these alleged killings are the following. Who carried out these killings and under what circumstances? And could Tolimir have reasonably foreseen them? Tolimir is not charged with participating in these killings." End of quote. In response to the first point, it is not necessary to establish the particular identities of the killers, provided there is evidence beyond reasonable doubt that the JEPA Muslim leaders were murdered, which is shown by the circumstances of their disappearance and the result of the exhumation at the Vragalovi gravesite. The relevant forensic evidence is cited at paragraph 475 of the prosecution's final brief. As for the circumstances of their disappearance, this is covered at paragraph 478. In response to the second point, that Tolimir is not charged with participating in these killings, as I said when I began, Tolimir absolutely is charged with all forms of Article 7.1 responsibility for these crimes, not just within the JCE framework. Again, I would remind your honours, as you have heard from Mr. van der Puy, that Tolimir had a duty to protect detainees, and this applied to the JEPA leaders as much as to the men and boys captured after the fall of Srebrenica. Tolimir not only failed in this duty, but his actions, through his subordinates, including Bejara, Picanac, and Čarkić, directly contributed to the deaths of Haric, Imamovic, and Palic. Turning back to Tolimir's final brief, he goes on to give an account of the custody of Haric, Imamovic, and Palic. and at paragraphs 482 to 486, he describes the supposedly correct treatment of these prisoners before concluding as follows. I quote, "Considering that Mehmed Hajrić and Amir Imamović were accommodated in an adequate holding centre, treated as prisoners of war, registered by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and allowed to send letters to their families, their alleged murder cannot be considered reasonably foreseeable. Tolimir's instructions contained in this document, Exhibit P1434, provide additional confirmation that Tolimir took an interest in the correct treatment of the prisoners of war from Dzepa." End of quote. Furthermore, at paragraph 495 of his brief, Tolimir notes, starting of quote, "Tolimir had already left for the Grahovo and Glamoch front on the 30th of July, 1995. End of quote. As I emphasised when talking about the opportunistic killings, the question of foreseeability is indeed central to the analysis of Tolimir's liability for these killings pursuant to JCE 3. Therefore, it is important to look at the point Tolimir has made here, which is essentially that the conditions in which Hajrić and Imamović were held, the fact that they were registered with the Red Cross, and that they were able to send messages to their families, meant that the possibility they might be killed was not foreseeable to Tolimir, who departed to another part of the country at the end of July. In fact, the evidence received by the trial chamber points to the opposite conclusion. That Tolimir knew of the possibility that prisoners who appeared to be treated correctly were in fact at risk, and his departure to Grahovo and Glamoch did not entail that he no longer knew what was going on in eastern Bosnia. I've already discussed the extent to which Avdo Palic's killing was foreseeable to Tolimir. For Hajrić and Imamović, in general, the foreseeability of their killings is covered in the prosecution final brief. But specifically with regard to Tolimir's comments about Hajrić and Imamovic's killings not being foreseeable because these victims were, to his knowledge, correctly treated and registered with the ICRC, that registration was a fig leaf to enable Tolimir and the VRS to claim that they treated prisoners in accordance with their duties under international law. The reality, as heard in the evidence, for example, of Meho Jabo and Hamdia Torlak, is that the conditions at the Rogotica prison were appalling. Not only were conditions appalling, but the evidence clearly shows that Tolimir's security and intelligence subordinates, including VRS Drina Corps security chief Vujadin Popovic, those subordinates operated a system to facilitate the mistreatment and murder of prisoners in pure contempt of the ICRC's efforts to register them. I refer your honours to Popovic's 20th of September 1995 instructions to cover up incidents where prisoners held by the VRS were killed in custody. That's Exhibit P2257, and also discussed at paragraphs 481 to 484 of the prosecution's final brief. Clearly, in accordance with these instructions from Popovic, the ICRC visitors to the Rogotica prison were told at the end of October 1995 that 3 of the men they had registered at the prison in July had, in quotes, escaped since the last ICRC visit. 2 of those 3 supposed escapees were Hajrić and Imamović, and that ICRC report is Exhibit P2253. As further evidence that the registration or record keeping of captives did not preclude the possibility that they might be killed, I would also remind your honours of the fate of the Milici patients. Records were kept of those men during their hospital treatment, but they were nevertheless handed over to Vujadin Popović and subsequently murdered. Indeed, the handover of the Milici patients to Popović took place only shortly after Tolimir spoke to him on the 22nd of July and told Popović to, I quote, "do your job." The story of the Milici patients reinforces the only reasonable conclusion, which is that in the circumstances after the Srebrenica murder operation, Tolimir could foresee the possibility that even Muslims who had been registered or documented, whether by the ICRC or anyone else, might be killed. As for Tolimir's departure to Grahovo and Glamoch on the 30th of July, being on the Western Front did not stop Tolimir, the Assistant Commander for Intelligence and Security, from keeping fully informed about matters in the east of the country. Just one example is Tolimir's 3rd of September 1995 communication to various VRS intelligence and security subordinates. That's Exhibit P2250, which deals in particular with prisoner-related matters, including the situation concerning prisoners in eastern Bosnia. I would like to end my presentation by reminding your honours of what we know of the final fate of Hajrić, Imamović and Palić. For Hajrić and Imamović, they were held in a prison cell known to the other prisoners in Rogatica as the infamous room. Meho Jabo testified that they called it the infamous room because, I quote, "because 90% of the time that someone spent there was torture, beatings. One could hear cries, screams, cries for help, and so on." End of quote. Survivors from the infamous room confirmed to Jabo that Hajrić and Imamović, as well as another man, Mujo Hodzic, whose remains were also found in the Vragalovi grave, were among those regularly beaten. Sometime in August 1995, Hajrić and Imamović were taken away in the night. Meanwhile, we know that Palić was held in secret and separately. He was also finally taken away in the night in early September 1995 by a man, Dragomir Pecanac, who worked for Tolimir and whom your honours have seen here in this courtroom. We don't have evidence about Palić's treatment during his detention, but we do have evidence from his grave, the same as for Hajrić and Imamović. All 3 men were shot. The conclusion for the autopsy of Avdo Palić's remains reads in part, I quote, "The death was violent, and it was caused directly due to the head injury. The fractures of the temple bone from the side, of the upper jaw, ribs 5, 6, and 7 from the right side, and 2, 3, 4, 6, 9 from the left side were caused by projectiles discharged from firearms." That's Exhibit P186. Your Honours, these 3 unfortunate men did not meet easy deaths, nor did those men killed opportunistically following the fall of Srebrenica. they should be done justice. Just as justice must be done for the thousands of other victims of the crimes charged in this case. That finishes my part of the presentation, Your Honour, and I think Ms. Hassan is following on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elderking. Welcome to the courtroom, Ms. Hassan. You have the floor now, but please be aware that Mr. McCloskey wants to have some minutes left at the end of today's hearing. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening to you. Good evening, Your Honors, and to everyone else. It is difficult, Your Honors, to speak about the impact of what happened in Srebrenica and Žepa in 1995. It is difficult to speak about the impact of events that have disgraced humanity. But I will try. The expulsion of the population of Srebrenica and Žepa, as well as the separation and murders of thousands of Srebrenica men and boys, irreparably destroyed the Bosnian Muslims of eastern Bosnia. What remains are charred fragments of the population struggling for their very existence until today. The society that remains in the aftermath of the events of July 1995, inflicted on them by the murderous criminal enterprise, is a society in despair, a society that at once clings onto the past and is horrified to face the future. A society that has lost its leadership and its identity. Over the course of this trial, you have received and heard evidence about the men who had to endure the painful separation from their families and the uncertainty that followed from not knowing what would happen to their loved ones and what their captors had in store for them. Their uncertainty was transformed to fear as they were forced to abandon their identification documents and personal belongings in Potocari, Sandici, and at other detention sites. Their captors' choice to detain them in the most deplorable and dehumanizing conditions, to deprive them of their rights as human beings. Their captors' choice to mistreat them converted their fear to sheer terror. These men endured terrifying moments as they were taken on buses and trucks, in some instances blindfolded and handcuffed to pre-selected execution sites. Over 7,000 men and boys endured this incomprehensible horror and pain before they faced a violent and merciless death. Few men survived these horrendous slaughters, and some of them have had the courage to sit here before you and to relate to you their ghastly experiences. It was not that long ago that a miracle, PW21, was in our presence. A boy who, against all odds, emerged alive from the mass execution at Orahovac. He witnessed the unfathomable, the murders of hundreds of men surrounding him, including his own father. Other fortunate survivors have told you how they narrowly escaped their deaths. You may recall, for example, PW18, who, after being severely beaten and shot, after witnessing his relatives' executions, found the strength somewhere in him and played dead on the hills of Nezuk as blood spewed from his mouth. This was the state he was in when he escaped execution. Remember PW-15. He took cover under a mass of people who had been executed before his eyes in Petkovsky. These men suffered physical injuries and immense mental anguish. All of them, those that were killed and those that escaped, endured profound horror at the hands of the joint criminal enterprise. After being uprooted from their homes, their land, their surroundings, and all that was familiar to them, the Bosnian Muslim women of eastern Bosnia were made to endure the intense heartache as they were torn from their relatives in Potocari before being expelled to Kladan. These final separations caused stress and anxiety amongst the women upon their arrival in Bosnian territory and continue to traumatize them some 16 years later. Your Honors, you have received the accounts of a number of Srebrenica widows and victim relatives, and I refer you to their statements. But I wish here now to give them a voice so that you hear a few of their words in this courtroom. The impact of the separations was described by Razia Pashagic, who said, and I quote, "The experience of being separated from my husband, my brother, and my friends was very difficult. I live, but actually my life does not exist. Or can we say my life goes on, but I do not exist?" The murders of the men was a monumental step towards the destruction of the women and children. For years, the Bosnian Muslim women of eastern Bosnia have lived in perpetual uncertainty and turmoil, wondering what happened to their loved ones, burdened and tormented by thoughts of how their loved ones died, where they died, whether they were tortured, whether they were hungry. You have heard compelling evidence about the Srebrenica syndrome and the psychological trauma experienced by these women. Teofika Ibrahim Efendic from the Viva Žene organization has described to you the symptoms these women have suffered from, amongst them terrible nightmares, feelings of fear, nervousness, and aggressiveness. Their will to live was extinguished. These women suffer from pronounced guilt, many wishing they would have died. Hanifa Hafizovic, and you have also received her statement, which is Exhibit P1522, has said, quote, "You can't go against God, but if God showed me mercy tomorrow and I died, I would be happy." Other women engage in self-destructive behaviors, and in addition to their mental suffering, many of these women suffer physically. With the advent of DNA matching, the women and children began learning about the fate of the missing men after many, many years. But they were not freed from the shackles of their misery when they received this information. The confirmation that their loved ones were in fact dead, that only body parts remained, and that in many cases only few body parts were found, that these body parts were spewed in mass graves at locations unknown to them. The reburial operation denied these women of a decent burial in accordance with their religious and ethnic customs, this also aggravating their mental suffering. It is difficult, Your Honors, to speak of any long-term recovery for these women, even for those we have heard have received treatment. Their condition is still extremely grave, and today, the condition of some of them has even worsened. The Srebrenica syndrome still plagues many women and families, as not all reported missing men have been identified. Innumerable women and families still live without knowing. Some perhaps will never know. Recall Mirsada Malagic. Her father-in-law, Omer Malagic, was only buried some 3 years ago. Her husband and her middle son were recently buried in 2010. We know that the mortal remains of her son Admir Malagic were located in the secondary mass grave you are now familiar with, Chanchari Road 6, primarily associated with the Branjevo farm executions. The remains of her husband, Salko Malagic, were found at Chanchari Road 10, also associated with the Branjevo farm executions. Her father-in-law was recovered from the secondary mass grave at Chanchari Road 3, associated with the Kozluk executions. Her eldest son, Elvir Malagic, who was 19 years old in July of 1995, remains missing. Elvir would have been 36 today. Time has stopped for Mirsada Malagic. She still waits, like thousands of others suffering, uncertain about the fate of her son. Many women have hoped against hope, like Samila Salcinovic, whose evidence you have also received. She doesn't want to remarry because she hopes that her husband will appear. Her statement can be found at Exhibit P1524. The story of Mirsada Malagic, Samila Salcinovic, and all the other Srebrenica widows the prosecution has presented to you are just a handful of the thousands of tragic stories of other families of the enclaves of Eastern Bosnia, families that have been dismembered and dispossessed. We have heard evidence that cohesive family units no longer exist. We have heard how those who once led social lives now isolate themselves and have developed fear and distrust of groups. We have learned that these survivors do not find any solace in numbers. Nura Efendic, a Srebrenica widow, who not only lost her husband but also her 2 sons, said that the fact that she tells herself that she's not the only one in this situation, knowing that, she says, quote, "there are thousands of us," close quote, is of no consolation to her. General Tolimir, a core member of the VRS, of the highest echelon of the VRS, and who lived and worked in the region, was intimately aware of the importance of the men in the traditional patriarchal societal structure of the Bosnian Muslims in Eastern Bosnia. By killing 2 or 3 generations of these men from Srebrenica, the Bosnian Serb forces and Tolimir knew and intended the catastrophic consequences the killings would have on the entire group. Eliminating the pillars of that society, the men and the leaders, guaranteed the collapse of the surviving members. As a result, certain family names are disappearing. The family name of Hanifa Hafizovic, for example, will disappear as 18 male members of her family went missing after the fall of Srebrenica. There are no men left to carry that family name forward. The grief and trauma of these women, resulting from the killing of the men, was compounded by their expulsion. They have not been able to reestablish their lives. The evidence shows that a lot of these families led reasonably prosperous lives before the war, under the guidance and protection and leadership of their husbands and fathers. Witness Rahima Malkic, as she put it, quote, had a nice life. She lived with her children and husband, worked their land, they owned sheep, cows, a horse, had chickens. They owned one house and were even constructing another house. But after having been uprooted from their homes in July of 1995 and having lost the male members of their family, life changed, and now they struggle to make ends meet. The vast majority of these women have not been able to reclaim their lives, to find employment to support their families, and have been forced to live in makeshift accommodation for many years. Samila Salcinovic, a newlywed at the time of the fall of Srebrenica, lost 9 male members of her family, including her husband. She found herself a refugee. She could not find a job and grows vegetables on a small piece of land, lives with no running water, and relies in her home and relies on a well for water, but that well dries up in the summer. The Bosnian Muslim women of Eastern Bosnia have suffered profoundly from the difficulties they have faced from taking on the responsibilities that used to be fulfilled by the men in that society. These men used to rely on these women used to rely on their men who were more educated to take care of official family business and to financially support them. The members of the criminal enterprise were fully cognizant that by killing the men, they were going to profoundly disrupt the foundations of this group as a whole. The physical destruction of the homes and the sacred places in Srebrenica and Žepa, described in the prosecution's brief at paragraphs 470 to 473 in relation to Žepa at paragraph 377. Paragraph 377 is in relation to Srebrenica, as well as the killing of the men and the physical and mental suffering resulting from the killing of the men and the expulsion of the women, has prevented those who survived from returning home. You may recall Mirsada Malagic's response when she was asked why she would not go back to her home. She said, quote, "It's impossible to live there." She explained, and I quote, "Anyone who survives Srebrenica, who survived the war, who went through everything that I went through, believe me, cannot live there." Rahima Malkic, who you did not hear testify but whose evidence was admitted, asked, quote, "How can I go back there when half my family is not there?" Her husband and 2 sons went missing after the fall of Srebrenica, and so she asks, quote, "How can I rebuild my house? I don't have any men who could help me." The women feel they cannot return to their homes alone, and in most cases, they don't have any homes to return to. Nothing remained in Žepa. Their homes were burnt down. There are no factories or jobs left to return to. Many of Žepa's inhabitants have resettled in other parts of the world, as the conditions in Žepa, as testified by Esma Palić, were, quote, "not fit for life." Nor do the Bosnian Muslim youth of Eastern Bosnia want to return. They dream of leaving Bosnia altogether. And let us not forget those Bosnian Muslim youth of Eastern Bosnia. Those that survived face significant hurdles, suffering from adjustment problems such as low levels of concentration, nightmares, flashbacks, fears, and behavioral problems. Those who have lost their fathers, their uncles, their grandfathers, lack male role models, which has affected their transition to adulthood, their families, and their sense of identity. What is sure is that the impact of this murderous operation will be significant for them for years to come. The impact of the ethnic cleansing on the population of Srebrenica and Jepa, as well as the separation and cold murders of the men, has caused incalculable suffering and damage to the tens of thousands of living survivors who have been condemned to a lifetime of physical and mental suffering. The impact on the group as a whole has been catastrophic, and this end result was purposeful. It was intended that there be no hope for further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Jepa. I have tried, Your Honors, to capture the pervasive and stifling impact on the individuals and the Bosnian Muslims of Eastern Bosnia as a whole. But it is perhaps best to leave you with the words of Amer Malagic, a relative of Srebrenica victims, who has said, quote, "Imagine what this has done to our families, and it is worse." This, Your Honors, is the impact of the death of more than 7,000 Bosnian Muslim men of Eastern Bosnia and the expulsion of the remaining population. This is the indescribable pain of thousands of families. This, Your Honors, is the intended, deep and lasting impact of the culpable decisions and actions of the RS leadership, of the VRS, and of General Tolimir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hassan. Now, Mr. McCloskey, you get the floor again. Exactly for 10 minutes, as requested.
Mr. President, I don't have much to say further. Words that I had on my paper and meant to say somehow after my friends and colleagues' presentations don't have the worth I thought they may have been. So I want to remind you of one thing, and that is General Tolimir. When we look at his intent, did he make this horrible crime his own? Or was he just someone that assisted along the way? We know that General Tolimir is a very bright, very impressive, one of the top 3-4 people of this hideous main staff and their ethnic cleansing. He stands as an example of VRS soldierdom, and his actions are something that will be looked upon and judged in history. He is a man that acts with his own free will. He voluntarily chose the path he took. When he was delivered this murder operation by General Mladic and its orders, he had several choices. He willfully, voluntarily, and intentionally chose loyalty to Mladic, loyalty to the cause, over his duty as a soldier and a man to stand down, his duty to his God to say no, his duty under law to stop and prevent and protect. He never uttered a word to the ICRC, to the press, to anyone to stop this or do anything about it. He adopted it for his own, for the purposes of the VRS, for the purposes of Mladic. We have never heard him utter a negative word against his leader and his loyal commander, General Mladic. He, in choosing Mladic over law, has lost his humanity, but he did this on his own free will. He is not someone that is merely assisting in this project or aiding and abetting. He represents this awful expulsion, destruction, this unique Srebrenica genocide is something that he carries with him personally and will forever. There is only one sentence for this crime, and that is life imprisonment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCloskey. I take that this concludes the final oral submission of the prosecution. We are now nearly at the end of today's hearing. Tomorrow, Mr. Tolimir will present his views during his final oral submissions. There's nothing we have to deal with today. Therefore, we adjourn and resume tomorrow in the afternoon, 2:15, in this courtroom number 3. We adjourn.
All rise. Free, fully.